When my kids were younger, we had a little game where we'd be talking about somebody who was particular or peculiar in some way, and I'd say, everybody's different, like snowflakes, or fill in the blank, or pancakes, or flowers, or clouds. Sometimes we'd reverse it, noting that no two sunsets were the same, and then we'd say, like people. Here at Mill Creek, we proclaim that all are welcome with all our differences. Of course, our differences are not always welcome in the wider world. Witness the current political efforts to exclude or repress differences in race, identity, orientation. Differences can be threatening, while conformity can seem comforting, at least to some. When I was growing up in the New York area, my favorite snack was potato chips, specifically Wise potato chips. I guess they still have them, but they're a little different now, but with the owl mascot. These were the old-fashioned kind of potato chips. That is to say, they were all different looking. I remember taking particular delight in finding and eating the most extreme, imperfect examples. Weirdly shaped green or brown or even black chips. You would get sometimes the burnt ones that they scraped off the bottom of the fryer. I figured if they put them in the bag, I could eat them, so I did. It was about this same time, in the mid to late 1960s, that the first example of what was technically called restructured potato chips, made from dehydrated potato molded into standardized chip-like forms, were introduced, including Chippos from General Mills, and most momentously, Pringles from Procter & Gamble. The FDA would forbid companies from calling these products potato chips. So different was the process by which they were produced, and so uniform the results. Of course, the whole point of Pringles is their lack of difference, their sameness, their almost geometric perfection, namely the opposite of the potato chip as it had previously existed, characterized by infinite variety, to use the Shakespearean term. It's not just potato chips. The valuing of sameness over difference permeates society more broadly. As Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote in 1841, the virtue in most request is conformity. Emerson, as you may know, was briefly a Unitarian minister in Boston before resigning and turning to life as a sort of public intellectual, launching the Transcendentalist movement in Concord, Massachusetts. Among the conventions that he wanted to transcend, foremost were conformity and consistency, the subjects of perhaps his most famous essay, Self-Reliance. Its theme is to trust your inner voice over and above conventional wisdom or established thought. A man should learn to detect and watch that gleam of light which flashes across his mind from within, he said, more than the luster of the firmament of bards and sages. The point is to be inventive, which Emerson equates with hope, rather than imitative, which leads to despair. Rejecting the sacredness of traditions, he urged one to define their own standards. Success came from speaking in one's true voice. Whoso would be a man, he wrote, must be a nonconformist. He who would gather immortal palms must not be hindered by the name of goodness, but must explore if it be goodness. Nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of your own mind. Some of you may recognize this quote from downstate at the Dogfish Head Brewery, where for years it was emblazoned on the side of the brewery building. And after some renovations, it's now in the taproom lobby. Dogfish takes nonconformity as its guiding principle, as epitomized by its slogan, off-centered ales for off-centered people. Their craft beers, which I highly recommend, are known for unusual and extreme ingredients and sometimes exotic brewing methods, in contrast to widely available mainstream or corporate beer like Budweiser. Beyond that, Dogfish promotes nonconformity and creative self-expression in all aspects of its culture. The point that Dogfish is taking from Emerson is to do something original, unconventional, and to redefine what it means to be successful on your own terms, but also, no pun intended, to tap into the creative potential of your own mind, to follow your own path. Over the years, Emerson's notion of self-reliance has sometimes been criticized as solipsistic and egotistical, self-centered. In another way, however, it is simply autobiographical. An independent and creative thinker, Emerson did not easily fit in the society of his day. He observed that conquered ladies out with their children would sometimes cross the street to avoid passing by Mad Dog Emerson. Even within the Unitarian Church, then as now somewhat at the fringe of mainstream religion, he was considered an outcast and a heretic. It took 20 years for his spirit of rebellion and anti-authoritarianism to be fully embraced by the church. His more immediate influence was on younger thinkers looking for alternative paths. And so Emerson became a mentor of sorts to the young Henry David Thoreau, whose Walden embodies the principles of Emersonian self-reliance. In Walden, Thoreau famously said, "Let everyone mind his own business and endeavor to be what he was made." He followed this by saying, the famous quote, "If a man does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it is because he hears a different drummer. Let him step to the music he hears, however measured or far away." It's worth unpacking that famous and well-worn metaphor. Marching to a drummer refers to the traditional military role of the drum major in regulating movements and activities of troops. So stepping to your own drummer is to be unregulated or perhaps self-regulated, setting your own standard and following where it may lead. It's the opposite of rote regimentation. Emerson and Thoreau's vision of the nonconformist is inseparable from their idea of originality and genius in the arts. Artists listen not to those around them, but to themselves. Paraphrasing Emerson, they speak not what those around them think, but what they themselves think. But another theme runs through Emerson's self-reliance, namely that trusting yourself, however imperative, is incredibly difficult, not only because of social pressure and stigma, but because of self-doubt and even shame. The deck is always stacked, figuratively speaking, against the nonconformist. As the poet E.E. Cummings would later say, to be nobody but yourself in a world which is doing its best night and day to make you everybody else means to fight the hardest battle which any human being can fight. Cummings was writing a century after Emerson, but very much in the same tradition. The son of a prominent Boston Unitarian family, Cummings himself had transcendentalist views. In his poetry, Cummings broke from conventions of punctuation and capitalization, as well as meter and rhyme. Underlying this formal rule-breaking was the desire to use language in his own unique way rather than to imitate the language of others. In 1955, when he was a renowned and successful poet at the end of his career, he was asked for advice by a high school student. His response, entitled A Poet's Advice to Students, distills his philosophy of the creative individual. He said, "A poet is somebody who feels and who expresses his feelings through words. This may sound easy, it isn't. Almost anybody can learn to think or believe or know, but not a single human being can be taught to feel. Why? Because whenever you think or you believe or you know, you're a lot of other people. But the moment you feel, you're nobody but yourself." As for expressing nobody but yourself in words, he said, that means working just a little harder than anybody else who isn't a poet can possibly imagine. Why? Because nothing is quite as easy as using words like somebody else. We all of us do this exactly nearly all the time. And whenever we do it, we're not poets. According to Cummings, when we use words like somebody else, we're not poets. Flipping it around, when we are truly speaking from a place within ourselves, using words like nobody else, then we become poets. Let's extend this idea to creativity in general, not just making great literature or art, but doing anything that adds a new perspective, a new reality to the world. The year after Cummings published A Poet's Advice, the painter Ben Shahn gave the Charles Eliot Norton Lectures at Harvard, which Cummings had given a few years previously. Shahn, a Lithuanian Jewish immigrant known for his social realist art and leftist politics, spoke in terms that unmistakably nodded to Ralph Waldo Emerson. Nonconformity, he said, is the basic precondition of art, as it is the precondition of good thinking and therefore of growth and greatness. All art, he explains, is based on nonconformity, and every great historical change has been based on nonconformity, has been bought either with the blood or with the reputation of nonconformists. Without nonconformity, we should have had no Bill of Rights or Magna Carta, no public education system, no nation upon this continent, no science at all, no philosophy, and considerably fewer religions. All that is pretty obvious, he says. But it seems less obvious somehow, he continues, that to create anything at all in any field requires nonconformity or a want of satisfaction with things as they are. The creative person, the nonconformist, may be in profound disagreement with the present way of things, or he may simply wish to add his views to render a personal account of matters. To create anything at all in any field requires nonconformity. For Shahn, the creative person and the nonconformist are synonymous. By defining creativity as not repeating things as they are, he is equating being creative, simply put, with being different. Put another way, creativity requires you fully to be yourself. But what exactly does it mean to be yourself? And for that matter, what does it mean to be creative? One of the great art teachers of the early 20th century, Robert Henry, an American painter, wrote about what he called the art spirit. Art, when really understood, is the province of every human being, he said. When the artist is alive in any person, whatever his kind of work may be, he becomes an inventive, searching, daring, self-expressive creature. Where those who are not artists are trying to close the book, he opens it, shows there are still more pages possible. The world would stagnate without him. The artist is something that comes alive within us when we venture beyond our existing limits. As Vashti's teacher said, just make a mark and see where it takes you. To be yourself, to be creative, is to take risks. It's to make mistakes. The author and graphic novelist Neil Gaiman gave a now legendary address to graduating students of the University of the Arts in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, where he extolled them to make mistakes. Because if you are making mistakes, he said, then you are making new things, trying new things, learning, living, pushing yourself, changing your world. You're doing things you've never done before. As Gaiman says elsewhere, make mistakes nobody's ever made before. Make your mistakes. So maybe to be yourself, to be creative, means to make mistakes that are uniquely yours. To be creative is also to make yourself vulnerable. As Gaiman said in his graduation address, the one thing that you have that nobody else has is you, your voice, your mind, your story, your vision. So write and draw and build and play and dance and live as only you can. The moment that you feel that just possibly you're walking down the street naked, exposing too much of your heart and your mind and what exists on the inside, showing too much of yourself, that's the moment you may be starting to get it right. Live as only you can. Be the person only you can be. In 1961, Buckminster Fuller, the architect and theorist, who himself came from a prominent Unitarian family, wrote of what he called the nonsensical illusion of conformity, pointing out that science has never found two individuals whose life patterns develop alike. To start off with, he notes, there are the fundamental difference in fingerprints. And it's not only fingerprints. To be a human being is to be different, like snowflakes or sunsets. For Fuller, this endless difference, this infinite variety in which patterns develop, was both a fact and a principle that took on almost theological overtones. I'm convinced, he wrote, that creativity is a priori to the integrity of the universe, and that life is regenerative and conformity meaningless. I'll read that again. I am convinced that creativity is a priori to the integrity of the universe, and that life is regenerative and conformity meaningless. Fuller's term regenerative, which has come into use lately as an environmental principle, was defined by the writer Calvin Tompkins as self-augmenting. It adds upon itself. It replenishes itself. Creativity, in this view, is a well that never runs dry. It is a dynamic rather than static process, open rather than closed. It is to boldly make a mark and see where it takes you, while conformity, in contrast, goes nowhere, which is what Fuller means when he calls conformity meaningless. Creativity, in contrast, is our precondition. In Fuller's sometimes paradoxical thinking, the illusion of fitting into society, Emerson's virtue most in request, ultimately leaves you fragmented, ironically disconnected, disintegrated. Conversely, it is by embracing your differentness, by being nobody but yourself, that you can achieve integration with the whole of the universe, expanding, as the prayer said, beyond the cobwebs of convention into the creative flow of infinity. May it be so.